A racist and corrupt police officer denied entry to a black woman at the doors of a federal courthouse, raising his voice, puffing up his chest, and standing tall in a uniform he thought gave him absolute power. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't care. All he saw was her skin, her natural hair, the confidence in her eyes that he mistook for defiance. And in that moment, he made a choice. A loud, irreversible, public choice. The wrong one. She didn't flinch when he barked at her. She didn't scream when he accused her of trespassing. She simply tried, one last time, to explain. But he raised his hand and cut her off with a smirk, that same smirk that too many black men and women have seen when justice folds under prejudice. His words burned the air around her as he spat them out, each syllable soaked in arrogance. I don't care who you think you are. You're not going through those doors. Staff goes around the back. You people don't get to just walk in here. She froze. Not out of fear. Not even shock. But the kind of deep, pulsing stillness that comes when someone rips your dignity away in broad daylight, in front of strangers, without shame. And the worst part? No one stopped him. A security guard looked the other way. A clerk lowered her gaze. A young intern pulled out his phone, not to call for help, but to film, just in case it went viral. She stood there, holding her breath, gripping her bag just a little tighter. Not because she was intimidated, but because she had a choice to make. To explode. Or to endure. And her endurance had been forged long before this moment. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this was her courtroom. And in less than 10 minutes, he was about to find out exactly who she was. But at that exact moment, none of that mattered. Because in the eyes of everyone watching, she was just a black woman being told to step aside, to know her place, to follow the proper protocol that only seemed to apply to people like her. And even as she tried to speak, her voice was drowned by his threats. If you don't leave right now, I will arrest you for interfering with a federal officer. Don't test me. That's what humiliation feels like. That hot, silent burn beneath the skin. The way the world slows down when someone decides you don't belong. The way your body betrays you by staying still when your spirit wants to scream. Every black person who's ever been dismissed, ignored, doubted, or denied for simply existing knows that feeling. The sting of being judged not by merit, but by melanin. The officer didn't see a professional. He didn't see authority. He saw a woman alone, unaccompanied, not wearing a judge's robe or an official badge around her neck. She had rushed from the hospital, her mother had just come out of surgery, and she barely had time to change. She wasn't thinking about appearances. She was thinking about a case that needed her ruling, about justice delayed being justice denied. But to him, all of that was invisible. Because all he saw was the skin she wore. And so she waited. Waited for the moment he finished his little show. Waited for the others to absorb what had just happened. Waited for her chance to turn everything upside down, not with rage, but with power. Real power. The kind that doesn't yell or threaten, but commands. When she finally entered the building, not through the back, but through the front, escorted by a federal marshal who recognized her immediately, silence followed her like a storm cloud. The hallway grew still. The officer's face dropped. His voice, once so full of force, cracked like thin ice. He started to speak, to explain, to backtrack. But it was too late. Because now, every eye was on her. And every heart was pounding. Who was this woman? What had he just done? And what was going to happen to him now? This isn't just a story about a racist cop and a judge. It's about what happens when justice shows up in a form no one expects. It's about how centuries of disrespect boiled down to one explosive moment. It's about what it means to take your power back, with poise, precision, and the law on your side. What she does next is not loud. It's not violent. But it is unforgettable. Because within minutes, the tables turn in a way that leaves the entire courtroom breathless. And the very man who tried to humiliate her is forced to stand in front of her, not as a guard, but as a defendant. This isn't a fantasy. This is reality. A carefully built reality, paved with years of excellence, resilience, and undeniable competence. This is the moment where silence is no longer survival, it's strategy. And when she finally speaks, everyone listens. But the real question is, how far will she go? Will she punish him to the full extent of the law? Will she show mercy? Will she make an example out of him, or will she take a higher road no one saw coming? Stay with us. You need to hear what happens when the law bends back toward justice, and hits exactly where it hurts the most. Because what she does with her power next, leaves everyone shocked. Before we begin this story, we want to send a clear and powerful message to every black viewer watching: you are seen. You are valued. You matter. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or hate. This platform is a safe space where real stories, emotional truths, and powerful comebacks are told with respect and dignity. If you've ever felt dismissed or judged unfairly, this story is for you. Get ready to feel every twist and turn. Now, sit back, breathe deep, and enjoy this powerful journey. And don't forget, subscribe to Plow of Twist and hit the like button so these voices keep being heard. Detroit was a city that carried scars. You could see them in the chipped bricks of old courthouses, in the cracked sidewalks of neighborhoods once full of laughter, and in the cautious eyes of people who had learned, over generations, how to keep moving forward even when the world tried to pull them back. It was in this city, still trying to heal from the wounds of injustice and inequality, that Judge Danielle Moore had carved her path. Danielle had grown up just a few blocks from the same courthouse where she now presided. Her earliest memories weren't of playgrounds or carefree summers, but of watching her father, a bus mechanic, come home with grease-stained hands and weary eyes. Her mother, a nurse who worked overnight shifts, raised her with strict discipline and unconditional love. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and they had rules. One of them: never let anyone tell you what you can't become. Danielle took that rule and turned it into a mission. She wasn't the type who ever needed to announce her accomplishments. Her presence alone said enough. Tall, composed, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a voice that held steady whether she was speaking to a senator or a teenager in trouble. Her success wasn't handed to her, it was earned in quiet, tireless hours. The law had always fascinated her, not just for what it was, but for what it could be. She believed justice wasn't meant to be locked behind traditions that excluded people like her. It was meant to be reshaped, reimagined, made accessible to everyone. That belief had carried her through law school, through grueling years as a public defender, and finally into the federal court system, where she shattered more than a few expectations simply by existing. But there were things her title couldn't shield her from. She knew what it felt like to be followed in a store. She knew the tight grip of a purse being pulled closer when she stepped into an elevator. She knew the coded language of interviews and meetings where she had to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. These weren't distant memories. They were realities she navigated even as she signed legal orders and sat on the bench. That duality, being respected in theory but doubted in practice, was a constant echo in her life. Outside the courtroom, Danielle kept to herself. She wasn't cold, just careful. Years of having her competence questioned had taught her that not everyone deserved access to her softer side. Her few close friends, including her mentor Judge Helen Foster and a longtime colleague in the DA's office, knew her loyalty ran deep. They also knew about the weight she carried. Being one of the few black federal judges in the state came with a responsibility she never asked for but embraced fully. She carried the hopes of many, and the skepticism of many more. The day it all happened, Danielle wasn't in her usual sharp suit. She had rushed to the hospital that morning after a phone call from the nurse. Her mother, whose health had been steadily declining, had suffered complications during dialysis. Danielle had stayed at the hospital for hours, holding her hand, watching machines beep and flash, listening to doctors explain outcomes she didn't want to face. When it was finally stable enough for her to leave, she drove straight to the courthouse. There was an emergency hearing scheduled, and as a federal judge, her presence wasn't optional, especially not in the high-profile civil rights case unfolding that week. She parked her rental car a few blocks away, her regular vehicle was still at the dealership for repairs, and jogged through the late-morning chill of downtown Detroit. Her coat barely shielded her from the wind, and her shoes weren't the polished heels she usually wore. She hadn't brought her robe or her badge lanyard. They were in her office, on the third floor of the courthouse. She had assumed she'd simply walk through security like usual, head up to her chambers, throw on her robe, and be in the courtroom within minutes. But that assumption collided with Officer Bradley Keener. Bradley had been working courthouse security for 7 years. He wasn't a cop in the traditional sense anymore, not since being transferred from street patrol following an internal investigation for excessive force that was swept quietly under the rug. His record wasn't clean, but he wore his badge with a false sense of righteousness. His worldview was narrow, his pride oversized, and his judgment swift. He believed he could tell who belonged somewhere and who didn't just by looking at them. When he saw Danielle approach the courthouse entrance, coat slightly wrinkled, hair pulled back in a rushed bun, face marked by exhaustion but chin still lifted, he made his decision instantly. She didn't fit the image in his head of authority. She didn't match the profile of someone important. He didn't see a judge. He saw someone he could control. Danielle walked toward the main entrance, where federal employees usually entered. It wasn't unusual. She had walked through those doors for months without issue. But this time, Bradley stepped in front of her, hand on his belt, eyes narrowed. "You need to step back," he said, his tone clipped and sharp, the kind used to assert dominance before any real conversation begins. Danielle paused, confused, but not startled. "Excuse me. You're not allowed in this entrance." "Staff goes through the back," he interrupted, already raising his voice slightly, drawing attention from the other guards stationed nearby. Danielle raised an eyebrow, trying to keep her tone even. "I'm not staff." I don't care who you think you are," he cut her off again. "This is a federal courthouse. You need proper credentials to walk in here. No ID, no entry." Danielle blinked. Not in surprise, but in recognition. She had seen this pattern before. She looked at the other guards, one of whom seemed to notice something was off but said nothing. The silence around her felt thick, charged. She slowly reached into her bag for her phone. Maybe calling one of the marshals could clear this up quickly. But Bradley's voice rose again. "Don't reach for anything. Keep your hands where I can see them." The irony of that phrase, one that had cost too many black lives, was not lost on her. She took a breath, put her phone back, and lifted her eyes to his. "I work here. I have urgent business inside. If you let me speak to, I've heard enough," he snapped. "This is a restricted entrance. You're causing a disturbance. If you don't leave now, I'll have no choice but to detain you." Danielle's jaw tightened. Her heart was steady, but her fingers curled slightly at her sides. She wasn't a woman who cried easily, and she wasn't going to start now. But beneath her calm was a fire. Not of rage, but of resolve. Inside the courthouse, in courtroom 2B, her name was already on the docket. Attorneys were preparing arguments. A clerk was wondering where the judge was. And the man blocking her path had no idea that the person he was threatening was about to determine the future of a case that had already stirred protests and headlines across the state. But none of that mattered yet. All that existed in that moment was the man with the badge, the assumptions he wore like armor, and the woman standing before him, stripped of her title, but never her dignity. What would happen next wouldn't just redefine their roles. It would ignite conversations throughout the entire city, challenge systemic assumptions inside one of the country's oldest institutions, and reveal just how deep prejudice can run, even in places where justice is supposed to be blind. And in the middle of it all stood Judge Danielle Moore. Composed. Determined. Unyielding. And ready. Shall we continue? The courthouse air was different the moment Danielle finally stepped through the doors. There was a stillness, not one of silence but of weight. Eyes followed her with confusion, then realization. A couple of staff members exchanged glances but didn't dare say a word. The federal marshal, Marcus Langston, a longtime colleague who had seen Danielle handle some of the most complex and controversial cases in the district, had been called down after someone inside realized the judge hadn't arrived on time. When he saw her standing outside the building, her posture tight and face unreadable, he knew something was wrong. The look in her eyes wasn't just frustration, it was deeper, colder, and focused. Without a word, he walked past the stunned officer, nodded to Danielle, and opened the door for her with respect that needed no explanation. The moment she crossed that threshold, she wasn't just a woman who had been humiliated. She was once again a judge, and the weight of her authority returned not as armor, but as a weapon sharpened by what had just happened. Her heels echoed down the hallway. Her steps were steady, not rushed. She moved like someone who was measuring the space, recalibrating the power dynamics that had just shifted. Bradley Keener, still standing at the security desk, watched her pass, something tightening in his throat as realization began to set in. But Danielle didn't look back. Not yet. Inside her chambers, her assistant Camille was already holding her robe, hands shaking slightly. She didn't speak, just helped her dress. Danielle didn't say much either. She didn't need to. The silence between them was full of understanding. Camille had witnessed enough in her life to know exactly what had happened without asking. Danielle glanced in the mirror once, adjusted the collar of her robe, and walked out. Her presence was magnetic, demanding. When she entered the courtroom, everyone stood. No one dared meet her eyes for too long. The attorneys quickly fell into place, the room adjusting itself around her as if to make up for the earlier imbalance. The hearing proceeded, her voice calm and precise, her decisions firm but fair. But beneath every word, there was a simmering storm. Her hands didn't shake, but her mind was calculating. She wasn't distracted, she was preparing. This wasn't just about what had happened at the door. It was about what it represented, what it revealed about the very institution she had dedicated her life to. She had been disrespected not just as a person, but as a symbol of justice. And justice, she knew better than anyone, had a long memory. After the court recessed for the day, Marcus returned to her chambers. He closed the door behind him carefully before speaking. "I saw the footage, Danielle. The security cam picked up the whole thing. You want me to file a report?" Danielle didn't look up right away. She was reviewing a file, her fingers tracing the edges slowly, thoughts racing behind her composed expression. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "Not yet. I want to handle this my way." Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised but not entirely. "You sure? This guy's got a history. Not the first time he's treated someone like trash." Danielle nodded slowly. "I know. I've heard whispers. I've seen complaints. But no one's ever followed through. He gets protected by people who think keeping things quiet keeps the peace. But silence only serves the powerful." Marcus hesitated, then gave a small nod. "All right. Just say the word." When he left, Danielle finally allowed herself to exhale. Her fingers clenched around the edge of the desk for a moment, grounding herself. She wasn't angry, not in the way most people understood anger. It wasn't explosive. It was exact. Strategic. She had spent her whole life learning how to channel it, mold it into action. And this time, she wouldn't let it slide. Not for her. Not for anyone who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or denied for simply existing in the wrong skin at the wrong place and time. That night, she drove home in silence. Her mother was stable but tired, and Danielle spent an hour by her bedside, just holding her hand, watching the rise and fall of her breath. Her mother didn't ask about the courthouse. Didn't need to. They had lived enough lives together to know what silence meant. Danielle kissed her forehead gently before leaving. As she stepped back into the night air, she pulled her coat tighter around her. Her phone buzzed. An email from the chief judge's office. A request for a meeting. Apparently, someone had reported an incident involving her that morning. The report didn't say much, but she could guess who filed it, and why. The nerve. The next morning, Danielle arrived at the courthouse before sunrise. She didn't want anyone around when she walked in. Not out of shame, but because she needed to center herself before what was coming. The building was quiet, the air cold. She walked slowly past the same security checkpoint where Bradley now stood stiffly, his eyes scanning her as if trying to decide whether to acknowledge her. She didn't give him the chance. Her gaze moved past him like glass. It wasn't a dismissal, it was erasure. But Bradley wasn't done. Later that day, he approached Camille under the pretense of checking on her. His tone was forced casual, but his eyes darted nervously. "I think there's been some misunderstanding with the judge," he said, leaning over her desk. "Did she, mention anything about yesterday?" Camille, who had worked with Danielle long enough to know exactly how to respond, didn't flinch. "She mentioned a lot of things. You'll find out soon enough." The courthouse was already whispering. Staff members talked in elevators, in break rooms, on phone calls. People who had witnessed the incident were speaking quietly, carefully, not sure what to expect. Some were nervous, others hopeful. Danielle wasn't known for spectacle. If she was moving in silence, that meant she was building something bigger than anyone could see. By the time the chief judge met with her, the tone was cautious. Professional. He asked if she wanted to file a formal complaint, offered support, even mentioned a possible transfer for the officer involved. But Danielle shook her head. "I'm not here for temporary solutions," she said calmly. "I'm here for accountability." He nodded, uneasy but compliant. "Then how would you like to proceed?" Danielle's answer was simple. "I'll handle it from the bench." That evening, she reviewed documents late into the night. Her office light was the last one on in the building. Camille stayed too, silently preparing the files Danielle requested. They were organizing more than paperwork, they were preparing a moment. One that needed to be flawless, not out of pride, but principle. At the same time, Officer Keener was beginning to panic. He had underestimated her. The murmurs were growing. He started digging, trying to see if he had any allies left. But no one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of this storm. Not now. Not after what they saw on the footage. He tried to justify it to himself. He had protocols. She didn't have ID. She wasn't in uniform. It wasn't about race, he told himself. But the more he repeated the lie, the hollower it sounded. Danielle, meanwhile, had no time for his internal unraveling. She had a message to deliver, one that wasn't just for him. It was for the system that allowed people like him to hold power unchecked. For every hallway that grew silent when injustice walked through it. For every whispered, "Let it go," that had buried real pain. And so, she waited. Waited for the right case, the right setting, the right moment. And when it arrived, no one would be ready for what she had prepared. Because this wouldn't just be a personal reckoning. It would be a public one. Calculated. Legal. And unforgettable. Something was coming. Something sharp, precise, and irreversible. And Bradley Keener had no idea how close he was to watching his authority unravel at the very feet of the woman he tried to diminish. shall we move into the climax? The courtroom was fuller than usual that morning. Word had spread, quietly, but quickly, that something unusual was about to happen. Clerks moved a little faster, attorneys sat a little straighter, and even the janitor stood still longer than he usually did after placing the water dispenser in the back of the room. Camille walked into the chambers early, holding a sealed manila folder under her arm, her face unreadable, her eyes locked ahead. She handed the folder to Danielle without a word. There was a shared understanding between them that transcended explanation. Danielle took it, opened it, and scanned its contents with the practiced calm of someone who had waited not just hours, but years, for a moment like this to be handled with exact precision. Outside, the noise of the city moved as usual. Inside, the walls of the courthouse felt tighter, as though they knew a reckoning was brewing. When Danielle stepped into the courtroom and the bailiff called the room to order, everyone stood, not just because it was protocol, but because something about her presence demanded it on a level beyond formality. She sat, nodded once, and gave a soft, "You may be seated," before turning to the clerk beside her. Her tone was formal, but her energy was charged with something different, something heavy but exact. "This morning," she began, her voice carrying across the room like a quiet wind cutting through still air, "we are opening proceedings on a matter of immediate concern. An internal petition has been reviewed and approved to hold a preliminary accountability hearing regarding misconduct by courthouse personnel." She didn't pause for effect. She didn't need to. "As the presiding judge of this district, I have been granted provisional authority to conduct this hearing in full transparency, with all involved parties present." There was a shuffle among the spectators. Some whispered. Others looked toward the side doors. Then she turned slightly, and her voice sharpened, not with anger, but with clarity. "Mr. Bradley Keener, please rise and approach the bench." The room froze. Keener, seated on the far end of the courtroom near the gallery, blinked as though he hadn't heard correctly. His face stiffened, color draining slowly. One of the junior marshals at the back took a step forward. Keener slowly stood, then looked around as if waiting for someone to interrupt, to stop this from happening. No one did. He walked down the aisle stiffly, like a man heading toward a ledge, not sure how far the drop would be. When he reached the front, he stood just feet from the bench. Danielle looked at him, but not in the way he was used to being looked at. There was no scolding, no theatrical reprimand. There was silence, a silence that bore down with more weight than any shouted accusation could. She lifted a page from the file and began to read aloud, her voice steady. "On the morning of March 14, 8:43 a.m., Officer Bradley Keener willfully impeded the entry of a federal judge through a lawful access point of the courthouse, issued threats of detention, and made remarks that demonstrated discriminatory profiling based on the judge's race and appearance. Said conduct was captured on security footage and corroborated by eyewitness testimony." Keener opened his mouth, but Danielle didn't stop reading. "The footage and documentation have been reviewed. Officer Keener's conduct is in direct violation of Section 41 of Federal Courthouse Ethics Protocol, as well as civil rights codes pertaining to racial discrimination in public federal spaces." Only then did she lower the paper. She looked directly at him, and in a voice so calm it chilled the room, she said, "Would you like to explain your actions?" Keener's voice came out weak at first, almost a whisper, then stronger, though laced with false confidence. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I was following security procedures. The individual didn't have credentials and was attempting to access a restricted entry without proper identification." Danielle didn't flinch. "Is that your full statement?" Keener hesitated. "I didn't recognize you, ma'am. If I had known who you were, I never." "That's exactly the problem, officer," she cut in, her tone still low. "You thought your behavior would be acceptable because you didn't recognize me. Because you assumed that someone who looks like me, dressed the way I was, couldn't possibly be someone who held authority here." He shifted, discomfort spreading across his face. "This hearing is not about whether you knew who I was. It is about the way you treat people when you believe no one of power is watching. There was a silence that swallowed the entire courtroom. Keener tried again, voice more desperate. I didn't mean any disrespect, Judge Moore. I swear, I was just trying to do my job. Danielle leaned forward slightly. And what part of your job includes telling a black woman to enter through the back? What part of your protocol includes threatening to arrest someone for calmly asking to speak? What exactly do you swear by when you wear that badge, Mr. Keener? His lips parted, but nothing came out. Danielle turned to the clerk and gave a small nod. Proceed with the presentation of evidence. A large monitor flickered to life beside the bench. The courtroom went dead quiet as the footage played. There was no narration, no voiceover, just raw video. Keener on screen, standing with crossed arms. Danielle off camera at first, then stepping into frame. The moment their interaction began, the tension in the courtroom became palpable. People watched as the exchange unfolded, the tone, the posture, the escalation. And then, those words. You people don't get to just walk in here. A collective breath was drawn across the room, like oxygen had just been pulled from the space. Keener looked down. Someone in the back gasped. Another whispered, Jesus. The video stopped. Danielle looked back at him. Do you stand by your statement that you followed protocol? His voice was barely audible. No, Your Honor. She leaned back slightly, studying him. Her expression betrayed no triumph, no vindication, only purpose. Officer Keener, you are hereby placed on immediate suspension pending formal investigation by the Federal Oversight Committee. During the period of suspension, you will relinquish your badge, your access credentials, and your clearance to all court-related systems and areas. Keener's body stiffened. His eyes were wide. Judge Moore, please. This is my job. I have a family. Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. So do the dozens of people whose rights you've likely violated without consequence because no one ever held you accountable. That ends today. He opened his mouth again, but the marshals were already moving. As they approached him, he stepped back, then looked around, hoping for support that wouldn't come. Camille stood at the far side of the room, arms crossed, unmoving. Marcus Langston stood near the exit, unreadable but firm. Keener hesitated, then finally handed over his badge, his hands trembling. The courtroom remained silent as he was escorted out. Danielle watched him go, not out of cruelty, but duty. And when he was gone, she turned back to the courtroom. This is not a spectacle. This is a standard. No one is above accountability, and no one should be beneath dignity. The spectators remained seated, the weight of her words holding them in place. No applause, no murmurs. Just stillness. The kind that follows truth spoken plainly and power used justly. As Danielle rose and exited the bench, Camille followed closely. The chamber's door closed behind them. For a moment, they stood alone in silence. Camille spoke first, her voice soft. You okay? Danielle nodded. I am now. But even as they stood in quiet, Danielle knew this wasn't the end. What happened in that courtroom was justice, but the system was far from healed. This case would trigger a ripple. And what she had done, bold as it was, had only scratched the surface. Because sometimes justice isn't just about the fall. It's about what rises after it. And what Danielle was preparing to rise next, would shake more than just a courtroom. Danielle didn't return to her chambers immediately after the hearing. Instead, she walked down the side corridor of the courthouse, the same hallway she had taken as a young clerk years ago when she still doubted if she'd ever belong in these walls. She moved slowly now, her robe flowing behind her, her heels muffled by the thick carpeting, every step deliberate. The echo of what had just happened still lingered in the corners of the building. Staff turned away as she passed, not out of avoidance, but reverence. Her silence had become louder than any gavel. She stepped outside through the rear exit where the air was cooler, clearer, and leaned against the stone pillar that overlooked the city below. Her fingers loosened slightly, and for the first time all day, she let herself breathe, really breathe. The adrenaline had held her together like glue, but now that it was over, the flood of everything began to rise. Not regret, not doubt, but the emotional cost of what it had taken to stay composed. She had faced down a man who had tried to strip her of dignity, and she had done it with the full weight of the law behind her, but no amount of authority could insulate a person from what that kind of humiliation feels like when it first hits. It stays under the skin. It moves slowly, like heat through glass. Camille found her there minutes later, holding a cup of coffee, her eyes searching Danielle's face as she handed it to her. There was no need for small talk. Camille just stood beside her, and they looked out across the rooftops, the clouds thick above them like everything they couldn't say out loud. Danielle finally spoke, her voice low. "It wasn't just for me. I hope you know that." Camille nodded, folding her arms across her chest. "I do. But it was also for you. And that's okay." There was a pause before Camille added, "He didn't think you'd follow through. He thought you'd take the high road and let it pass like all the others before." Danielle looked down into her coffee for a long moment. "I've taken the high road so many times I forgot what ground feels like." Camille smiled faintly but didn't laugh. Her face softened, and she whispered, "Today, you made all of us feel seen." Danielle turned slightly toward her, eyes sharper now, but warm. "This place doesn't change because of rules. It changes because people decide enough is enough. Because we choose to stay, even when it chews us up." Camille's voice cracked just a little. "You chose to stay. And look what that did." Danielle didn't respond right away. She looked at the skyline again, and the silence between them settled into something calm. A minute later, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then handed the device to Camille. "It's him." Camille didn't need to ask who. She hesitated, then answered. Danielle stayed quiet as the voice on the other end came through the speaker. It was Marcus. "We've got a situation," he said, tone clipped and controlled. "Keener's filed a counterclaim." Camille froze mid-step, staring at the phone. Danielle's face didn't move. "What grounds?" "He's claiming racial bias. Says he was targeted for being white in a political spectacle. He's hired legal counsel, one of those media-driven law firms. And it's already hitting certain blogs." Danielle exhaled slowly through her nose, eyes steady. "Let them post. Let them spin. This is not a story about a white man being punished. It's a story about accountability. If they want a trial, we'll give them one." Camille ended the call and looked at her with concern. "Are you ready for that kind of heat?" Danielle smiled without warmth. "Camille, I was born in it." Over the next few days, the courthouse transformed from a building of quiet protocol to a storm of whispered meetings, strategic memos, and national headlines. Commentators debated Danielle's actions on morning shows. Civil rights organizations released statements of support. The mayor's office called requesting a closed-door meeting. The chief judge remained diplomatic but visibly tense. The pressure was growing from every direction, not to reverse the decision, but to contain it, to manage the perception. One afternoon, as Danielle prepared to leave, a knock came on her door. She glanced up, surprised to see Marcus standing there in full martial gear, face tight. "There's someone here to see you," he said carefully. "He asked to speak to you privately." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Marcus hesitated. "It's him. Keener." Danielle stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "Let him in." When Keener entered the office, he looked nothing like the man who had stood with pride at the security desk just days ago. He looked smaller, shoulders hunched, suit poorly fitted, as if it belonged to someone more put together than he was right now. He stood silently for a few seconds, then finally spoke. "I didn't come to argue." Danielle sat still. "Then speak." He shifted uncomfortably. "I came to say. I didn't expect it to go this far." Danielle's face didn't move. "What did you expect, Mr. Keener? That I would take your disrespect and walk away quietly?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I've worked in this building a long time. I've seen things go sideways for good people. I know how this can play out, for both of us." Danielle's voice was ice. "You think we are in the same storm, Mr. Keener? We're not. You had the shield of ignorance and power. I had to build mine from the ground up. The cost of your mistakes is temporary. The cost of your assumptions nearly erased who I am in front of a crowd. Do you understand the difference?" He looked down, shame blooming in his expression. "I do now. I think I do." Danielle stood slowly, not in anger, but in finality. "You don't get to rewrite this. You can make peace with it. You can learn from it. But you don't get to reshape it into something that makes you feel less guilty." He nodded slowly. "So what happens next?" She stepped closer, holding his gaze. "What happens next is you decide what kind of man you want to be when no one's watching. The courtroom has already spoken. But your sentence, that's yours to carry." Keener didn't answer. He just nodded, quietly, and turned to leave. After he left, Camille stepped into the room. Her eyes were questioning. Danielle simply said, "It's done." "But it's not over." Camille walked to the window and looked down at the street. Protesters were starting to gather. Signs. Chants. Voices rising, not in violence, but in power. Not because of hate, but because someone finally stood in a place they were never meant to reach, and said enough. And Danielle knew then that this wasn't just about one man, one badge, or one courtroom. This was about every time the system had looked someone in the face and told them to go around the back. And finally, someone had said no. She stood by the window with Camille and watched the crowd swell. It wasn't chaos. It was clarity. Because the storm had already passed. Now it was time to rebuild. In the days that followed the hearing, the courthouse became a living symbol of contradiction. On the outside, it remained a structure of concrete, glass, and federal authority, but on the inside, it pulsed with discomfort. The air felt heavier, the eyes of employees carried questions they were too afraid or too ashamed to ask aloud. Every hallway Danielle walked down came with quiet tension, some stairs carried silent respect, others discomfort, and a few still lingered in resistance. Yet no one could deny that something had shifted. The case had left behind more than a ruling. It had left behind a wound wide open for the institution to either heal properly or let fester again under the bandage of silence. And Danielle could feel it every morning when she stepped out of her car, every time she passed through the metal detectors, every time someone who used to nod casually now dropped their eyes. Her position hadn't changed, but the weight of it had multiplied. News outlets had dissected the moment from every angle. Some hailed it as a landmark victory for accountability in federal institutions, others questioned whether Danielle had let her personal experience interfere with her judicial objectivity. Public opinion split down predictable lines. One segment of the population stood in solidarity with her courage and applauded her for forcing a system to look at its own reflection. The other, louder and more agitated, painted her as vengeful, biased, or worse, unprofessional. And while she had expected the backlash, she hadn't expected the isolation it would bring. One morning, Camille placed a stack of printed emails on Danielle's desk. Hate mail, some of it disguised as feedback. Anonymous messages with phrases like, "reverse racism," and, "you're the real problem with this country." Danielle read a few and then pushed the stack aside without a word. It wasn't the first time she'd been called names, but there was something different about this wave. This time, it wasn't aimed at who she was, but what she represented. Her authority had disrupted a hierarchy built on unspoken rules. And now the system, offended by the shift, was pushing back with passive aggression. Meeting requests disappeared. Invitations were rescinded. Conversations hushed when she entered rooms. It wasn't open war, it was cold distancing, designed to make her question whether it had been worth it. But she didn't question it. Not once. The silence only fueled her resolve. Yet in the quiet of her apartment, when the day had long ended and the city buzzed beneath her windows, the emotional cost surfaced. She would sip tea while reading briefs, then pause, and stare blankly at a wall, feeling the ache that came not from regret, but from exhaustion. This kind of justice had always been expensive. And now, even more than ever, she understood how few people were willing to pay the price for it. Then came the letter. Not an email. Not a memo. A real letter, handwritten, left anonymously in her office inbox. Camille found it and hesitated before handing it over. Danielle opened it slowly, expecting more of the same. But the words inside didn't sting, they cut in a different way. I saw what happened. I've worked here for 15 years. I've seen what they do when no one powerful is watching. I've kept my head down, tried to survive, but I've always known it was wrong. Watching you stand up the way you did, made me realize I've been part of the problem too. Thank you. I don't know what comes next, but I wanted you to know, you're not alone. Danielle read the letter twice. Her hand trembled slightly as she folded it and placed it in the top drawer of her desk. That drawer was usually reserved for signed judgments and sealed orders. But this letter held more weight than most legal documents she'd ever touched. The next week, a meeting was scheduled with the Federal Oversight Committee. Not to revisit the ruling, no one could touch that now, but to review her conduct, her motives, and whether she had abused her position for personal retaliation. It was a move she anticipated, but still, the sting of it was sharp. She wasn't just being questioned as a judge, she was being challenged as a black woman who dared to wield authority without apology. Camille walked her to the meeting room, heels clicking against the hallway's marble tiles, the air between them heavy. As they reached the double doors, Camille paused. You know this isn't about your judgment. It's about their fear. Danielle turned to her, her voice steady. I know. But I'm not here to ease their fear. I'm here to remind them that justice isn't theirs to gatekeep. Inside the room sat a panel of 5 individuals, diverse in appearance, not so much in perspective. The questions began with polite tones, procedural framing. Can you walk us through your decision-making process? Were there alternative channels you considered before proceeding publicly? Do you believe your personal experience biased your response? Danielle answered each with clarity, not defensiveness. She outlined the legal statutes, the precedent, the evidence. She explained the patterns of misconduct that had long gone unchallenged. She presented the security footage again, but this time accompanied by a timeline of complaints filed over the past 5 years, most of them dismissed without review. Then came the question that drew the longest silence. Judge Moore, if presented with a similar situation again, would you handle it the same way? Danielle didn't blink. I would act faster. There was a pause, then a shift in the room. Not quite approval. Not quite disapproval. Just wait. The kind that falls when truth is spoken plainly. When the meeting ended, Danielle walked out with her head high. But something deeper inside her had started to crack, not from weakness, but from the relentless burden of holding the line alone. Later that night, as she sat by her mother's bedside, listening to the rhythmic beep of the monitor, she reached for her mother's hand and whispered, "I'm still standing." Her mother stirred slightly and gave the smallest squeeze in return. "I know, baby," she said weakly. "But standing tall don't mean standing alone." The words echoed through Danielle long after the machines resumed their rhythm. 2 days later, a surprising shift occurred. The district clerk's office sent word that a petition had begun circulating among courthouse staff, clerks, assistants, marshals, and even a few attorneys, publicly supporting Danielle's decision and calling for systemic review of internal conduct policies. Over 100 signatures had been collected in less than 48 hours. Camille brought her the petition and laid it gently on the desk. "They started this without us. It's real." Danielle looked at the signatures and felt something warm press into her chest. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't needed the validation. But knowing that her actions had rippled outward, had sparked courage in others, meant more than any title. Still, the fight wasn't over. The following week, she was assigned a high-profile civil liberties case involving allegations of racial targeting in a local police precinct. The pressure to recuse herself came instantly. Headlines began to whisper, "Is Judge Moore too close to the issue?" Blogs recycled the footage of her courtroom confrontation, twisting it into propaganda. Her email inbox exploded. And yet, she did not step back. Danielle met with Marcus behind closed doors, her voice calm but decisive. "They want me off the case. They're afraid I'll bring a bias into it." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "What do you plan to do?" She exhaled slowly. "Exactly what they're afraid of. Bring the truth into it." But as the trial date neared, the weight of her choices became clearer. Every decision was now seen through a distorted lens. If she ruled one way, she'd be accused of vengeance. If she ruled the other, she'd be accused of weakness. There was no safe path forward. And that, right there, was the moral dilemma. She had the power to deliver justice. But the cost of using that power could compromise everything she had built. How do you fight for what's right when the system punishes you for succeeding? How do you lead others forward when every step you take is weaponized against you? She sat with Camille in her office late one night, looking over the case files, the city lights glowing through the window. "Tell me the truth," Danielle said softly. "Do you think I've gone too far?" Camille leaned back, eyes locked on hers. "I think you're not going far enough." Danielle studied her for a long moment. And something inside her began to steady again. The fallout wasn't over. The final blow hadn't landed. But it was coming. And Danielle Moore was ready to meet it head-on. The evening before the civil liberties case was set to begin, Danielle sat alone in her chambers long after the courthouse had emptied out. Her robe was folded neatly across the chair beside her, the weight of it more symbolic now than practical. The lamp on her desk cast a soft, golden light over the case files sprawled before her, affidavits, body cam transcripts, internal reports thick with redactions. The case involved a young black man wrongfully arrested and assaulted during a traffic stop. It had all the hallmarks of systemic abuse, and now it sat squarely on Danielle's desk like a test she never asked to take. There was no confusion about the facts, the evidence was clear, the misconduct undeniable, but Danielle knew the real question looming wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about whether she had the right to judge it. Camille entered quietly, placing a warm mug of tea beside the files. Her eyes lingered on Danielle, searching her face. Danielle didn't look up. She was still reading, her fingers moving slowly across a line of text. Camille finally broke the silence. "They're pushing hard for your recusal. For news outlets already running op-eds about judicial impartiality. You're being painted as a crusader now. They're not attacking your decisions, they're attacking your integrity." Danielle leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. "That's the strategy. If they can't discredit the facts, they discredit the one delivering them." Camille sat across from her, voice lower now. "You could step back. Let another judge take it. You've already done enough." Danielle's eyes lifted, locking onto hers. "That's the difference between surviving and changing the system. If I step back now, I teach every young judge of color that they have to choose between their truth and their position. That silence keeps them safe. That dignity comes second to comfort. I won't pass that down. Camille blinked slowly, then nodded. Then we go through with it. But you won't be walking into that courtroom alone. Danielle gave a faint smile, not of comfort, but of solidarity. The next morning came fast, wrapped in thick clouds and biting wind. Protesters gathered again outside the courthouse, this time with signs showing Danielle's face beside the words, "Let her lead." Others held placards with the names of victims who had never gotten their day in court. Inside, the courtroom filled with media, attorneys, community leaders, and quiet tension. Danielle entered through the main hallway this time, not flanked by marshals but walking calmly, her robe flowing behind her. She didn't acknowledge the cameras. Her focus was singular. When she took the bench, the courtroom stood, and for a moment, all the noise outside faded into a silence so deep it felt like the world held its breath. She opened with procedural statements, her tone as even as ever, but beneath every word was the unmistakable presence of a woman who had nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. The defense team, sharp-suited and smug, moved quickly to file their motion for recusal. The lead attorney, a man named Ellison Carr, stood with the air of someone expecting to win not by logic, but by pressure. He spoke with calculated charm, his voice smooth. "Your Honor, we respectfully submit that due to the recent events and the public nature of your confrontation with a federal officer, your continued presence on this bench during a trial involving law enforcement bias may unintentionally compromise the perception of impartiality." Danielle listened without interrupting, her hands folded. When he finished, she asked a single question. "Mr. Carr, are you questioning the ability of this court to interpret law without emotional interference, or are you questioning my ability as a black woman to do so?" The room went still. Carr shifted slightly. "Your Honor, I'm only suggesting that, given the optics," Danielle cut in, not sharply, but firmly. "Optics are the problem we're here to fix, Mr. Carr. Not cater to. Your motion is denied." He opened his mouth to respond, but she'd already turned to the clerk. "Proceed with opening statements." The prosecution laid out their case with chilling clarity. The young man, Jordan Reeves, had been pulled over for a minor taillight issue. Within minutes, he was face down on the pavement with a broken wrist and a fractured rib. No arrest was made. No charges filed. Just pain, humiliation, and silence. The defense pushed back with tired strategies, protocol, compliance, officer safety. But the courtroom was listening differently now. Danielle had changed the tone without raising her voice. Her presence was a reminder that justice could wear many faces, and that its voice didn't have to shout to be heard. During a recess, Camille found Danielle in the hallway outside the courtroom, her face tight. "Jordan's mother is here," she said. "She wants to speak with you." Danielle hesitated, then nodded. "Bring her in." The woman entered slowly, a small figure in a worn cardigan, her hands trembling slightly. Danielle stood to greet her, but the woman shook her head gently. "I don't need you to say anything, Judge," she said. "I just wanted to look you in the eye and say thank you. They told me to stay quiet. Told me it wouldn't go anywhere. But now my son knows someone sees him. That means more than any verdict." Danielle's eyes softened. She reached for the woman's hand, held it for a moment. "He deserves more than visibility. He deserves justice." The woman nodded, tears gathering but not falling. "So do you." When the trial resumed, Danielle held her posture as the defense cross-examined Jordan, trying to trip him up, painting him as aggressive, unpredictable. But Jordan held his own. His voice wavered, but his truth didn't. He looked at Danielle once, just for a second, and in that moment she saw herself, not as a judge, not even as a leader, but as a reflection of every black person who had ever been asked to stay quiet, to shrink, to survive. The defense tried again on closing day, calling back their argument for mistrial, pushing the narrative that Danielle's past actions had compromised the court. But this time, the gallery stirred. People were no longer passive observers. They were witnesses to a shift. Danielle delivered her final instructions to the jury, her voice unwavering. You are not asked to render a decision based on sympathy, nor to correct centuries of injustice. You are asked to look at the facts, weigh the truth, and remember that justice isn't about comfort. It's about accountability. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Camille stepped into her chambers, this time more solemn than ever. Danielle sat with her head bowed, eyes closed. Do you ever regret it? Camille asked softly. Standing up that day. Starting all of this. Danielle opened her eyes slowly, then looked up. Every night, she said. But never for the reason they think. Camille sat beside her. Then what's the reason? Danielle exhaled. Because it shouldn't have taken me to break it open. Because too many who came before me were silenced. And because some days, I still wonder if anything will really change. Camille placed a hand over hers. It already has. The jury returned the next morning. The verdict was read in complete silence. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom didn't erupt. There were no cheers. Just the soft exhale of collective relief, the sound of justice being released into air that had been heavy for too long. Danielle stood, thanked the jury, and recessed the court. But the story wasn't finished. The verdict was just a ripple. And the real question still hung in the balance. What would Danielle do next? Because justice had been served. But power still had a price. Months passed. The courthouse regained its usual rhythm, but the pulse beneath had changed. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in the halls and hearing rooms, but in the people who moved through them. Danielle's presence had become more than judicial. It was symbolic. She no longer just interpreted the law, she embodied what it looked like when someone dared to challenge its flawed enforcers from within its own walls. The verdict in the Jordan Reeves case set a precedent, but more importantly, it set a tone. A tone that whispered, "We are watching. We are no longer silent. We are not afraid to call injustice by its name, even in the most sacred halls of power." And as Danielle walked into that same courthouse each morning, her head high, her step steady, she carried with her not only her dignity, but the weight of those who never got the chance to reclaim theirs. Officer Keener was never reinstated. The Oversight Committee, pressured by public scrutiny and mounting internal complaints, conducted a formal inquiry that unearthed years of misconduct that had been buried under silence and paperwork. He lost his badge permanently. The countersuit he filed never saw trial. His attorney quietly withdrew after leaked footage revealed that Keener had made several racially charged remarks during his previous posts. He vanished from the public eye soon after, retreating into a life far removed from the power he once abused. No media farewell. No redemptive statement. Just the slow, quiet crumbling of a man who had built his authority on fear, only to see it collapse under the weight of his own actions. Camille received an offer from a national civil rights organization, one that had followed the case closely and admired the composure and dedication she showed beside Danielle. She accepted the offer but not before ensuring a proper transition for the judge she had come to see not just as a boss, but as a beacon. Their goodbye was short, but full of unspoken depth. Camille promised to carry Danielle's lessons into every room she entered next, and Danielle gave her a small pendant that once belonged to her mother, a quiet, powerful symbol of legacy. Jordan Reeves, now a voice beyond the courtroom, began speaking at schools, community centers, and legal panels. His story was no longer one of victimhood but of survival and transformation. He'd found purpose in helping others navigate the same dangers he'd once thought were unique to him. His family healed slowly, scars still visible but no longer bleeding. And his mother, who once sat trembling in a federal hallway unsure if her truth would be heard, now smiled every time she saw her son walk confidently toward a microphone, knowing his words mattered. As for Danielle, the offers came: book deals, interviews, political endorsements. But she turned them all down. Not because she feared the spotlight, but because her purpose wasn't in fame. Her fight was in the courtroom, in the rulings, in the letters she now received from law students across the country, many of them black women, thanking her for showing them that authority didn't require permission. She quietly launched a mentorship initiative, placing underrepresented law students in clerkship programs across the state. She fought not only from the bench, but by opening doors that had been closed for generations. Her chambers remained quiet, her demeanor unchanged, but those close to her knew the fire hadn't dimmed. It had evolved. One morning, as she walked through security, the new officer at the front, a young black woman named Ayanna, stood up straighter and greeted her with a proud, respectful nod. Danielle paused, smiled softly, and nodded back. It wasn't a performance. It was a passing of the torch. A moment that needed no words. And in that same hallway where it all began, where power was once challenged and reclaimed, Danielle stopped to greet a group of visiting students. One of them, a teenage girl with big eyes and braids tucked beneath a school hoodie, asked shyly, "Are you the judge from the news?" Danielle crouched slightly, looked her in the eye, and smiled. "Yes. But more importantly, I'm someone who didn't stop, even when they tried to make me feel small." The girl smiled wide, and for a moment, the courthouse wasn't a place of fear or protocol. It was a place of possibility. Now, if you've stayed with this story until the end, I want to ask you something, not as a narrator, but as someone who believes that stories like this matter. How many times have we watched people in power abuse their position because they were certain no one would hold them accountable? How often do we doubt our own right to take up space, to speak out, to demand the respect we've earned? Danielle's journey isn't just a courtroom drama. It's a mirror. A reminder that dignity doesn't come from titles, it comes from courage. And justice isn't just about laws, it's about those willing to enforce them, even when it costs them comfort. Her silence in the face of humiliation wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Her calm wasn't surrender, it was control. And when she finally spoke, the world had no choice but to listen. So, I leave you with this question: what would you have done in her place? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace? Or would you have spoken up, knowing the price might be high, but knowing the silence would cost you even more? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what justice means to you. Tell us if this story made you feel something you didn't expect. Because stories like this aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be felt. And if you believe that more people need to hear stories like Danielle's, then make sure you subscribe to Tales of Twist. Like this video, share it, and join this growing community of voices that are unafraid to challenge, to feel, and to rise. Until the next story, keep listening, keep reflecting, and never stop standing for what's right.